January 17th, 1945. The morning fog clings to the jagged ridges of a remote Pacific island. The air is thick with salt, smoke, and a faint stench of burned vegetation. From the jagged cliffs, Japanese infantry peer through slit trenches, their eyes narrowing at the horizon, expecting the familiar roar of artillery and the methodical approach of American tanks. Then, a new sound shatters the rhythm of war, a deep, guttural rumble, followed by a shriek that seems to split the sky. American Sherman tanks, mounted with racks of rocket launchers, emerge from the treeline. The first salvo tears through the morning mist, the rockets streaking like vengeful comets, landing with thunderous explosions among the stunned Japanese lines. Men are thrown to the dirt, foxholes collapse under the concussive blast, and the once confident defenders recoil in disbelief. Smoke curls upward, mingling with the fog. Fear, awe, and confusion ripple through the ranks. The battlefield has changed in an instant. The Japanese infantry could scarcely believe what they had just witnessed. A new era of firepower had arrived. This sudden eruption begs the question: how did the Americans develop and bring this terrifying weapon to the front lines? The Pacific War, by late 1944, had entered a relentless, grueling phase. The Japanese Empire, once an unstoppable force sweeping across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, had begun to feel the weight of the Allied response. Each island, each atoll, became a fortress. The United States, having learned the bitter lessons of earlier encounters, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, approached each campaign with meticulous planning, overwhelming firepower, and a growing reliance on technological innovation. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved into a chillingly effective system of entrenched positions, tunnels, and bunkers. Infantry were trained to hold ground at nearly any cost, to fight from prepared positions, and to exploit the dense jungles, rocky ridges, and cratered landscapes of the islands. They relied on well-hidden machine guns, mortars, and artillery emplacements, often positioned to channel attackers into kill zones. Every hilltop and ridge became a fortress, every cliffside a potential death trap. Their discipline was legendary, their willingness to die unflinching. American forces, however, had grown increasingly creative in countering these defenses. Traditional artillery had long been the mainstay of softening enemy positions before infantry assaults, but it was slow, methodical, and predictable. Commanders recognized the need for something faster, more flexible, capable of saturating an area in moments rather than minutes. The solution emerged from a fusion of existing technology and battlefield necessity: rocket artillery. Mounted on the familiar M4 Sherman tank chassis, these rocket launchers, often called the T-34 Calliope, transformed the tank from a mobile gun platform into a terrifying ground-to-ground missile system. Capable of firing dozens of rockets in rapid succession, the system could blanket Japanese positions with a wall of fire, shaking morale, collapsing trenches, and disrupting defensive lines. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. Infantry caught in the open had little time to react, and even well-dug foxholes offered limited protection. The strategic implications of this technology were immediate. In campaigns across the Central and South Pacific, the Americans increasingly relied on combined arms tactics. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support working in coordinated attacks. Rocket artillery allowed for precision-saturated bombardments that softened the enemy without exposing advancing infantry to the same level of risk as conventional frontal assaults. It was a new tool in a war that had already become industrialized and mechanized to an unprecedented degree. Island by island, the Americans pushed forward. Each landing, whether on the beaches of Leyte, the cliffs of Iwo Jima, or the coral slopes of Okinawa, presented a unique tactical problem. Japanese defenders dug deep into the terrain, often linking caves and tunnels, creating labyrinths designed to force attackers into narrow choke points. Conventional artillery, though devastating, required time to register, adjust, and concentrate fire. Rocket artillery offered immediacy. A salvo could erupt across a ridge in moments, destroying positions before defenders could even react. Commanders on both sides understood the stakes. For the Japanese, every delay in the Americans' advance meant more time to prepare, more opportunity to inflict casualties, and a chance to defend the Empire's territory to the last man. For the Americans, speed, firepower, and shock were critical. Rocket artillery became both a weapon and a statement. The battlefield was no longer governed solely by entrenched positions and courage. Technology, mobility, and the element of surprise were now decisive. By late 1944, reports from frontline units began filtering back to commanders in the rear. Accounts of Japanese troops being thrown from their positions, foxholes collapsing under the sudden eruption of rocket salvos, and entire ridges being engulfed in fire were becoming common. Soldiers spoke of the terrifying whistle of the rockets overhead, a sound that seemed to herald inevitable destruction. The rocket's impact was immediate, devastating, and unlike anything encountered in earlier engagements. But rocket artillery was not just a tool of destruction. It represented a shift in military thinking. The Americans were no longer relying purely on attrition. They were engineering situations where enemy defenses could be neutralized rapidly, giving infantry and armor the advantage of momentum. The effectiveness of these weapons was rooted not only in their firepower, but in the psychological toll they exacted. Commanders knew that a soldier's perception of invincibility often mattered as much as the strength of his trenches. As the fog of war settled over each contested island, one fact became clear. The Japanese infantry, steeped in tradition, discipline, and a belief in their ability to hold ground, were facing a new form of warfare. One that combined ingenuity, mechanization, and sheer destructive capacity in a way that made the impossible suddenly plausible. By the time American rocket artillery began its barrage, the battlefield had already been redefined. This context, the convergence of technology, strategy, and human endurance, set the stage for the dramatic moments that would follow. Moments that left Japanese soldiers staring in disbelief, their world literally shaken by the roar of rocket fire. By early 1945, the U.S. forces were preparing for some of the bloodiest island campaigns of the Pacific War. Islands like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Leyte had become crucibles of modern warfare. Small landmasses transformed into heavily fortified death traps. Every ridge, cave, and cliff was weaponized. Japanese infantry doctrine had evolved into an unyielding, almost ritualized form of defense. Soldiers were drilled to hold their positions at all costs, to exploit terrain, and to use every advantage the environment could offer. Their foxholes were deep, camouflaged, and interconnected by tunnels that allowed rapid movement and counterattacks. American planners knew that conventional artillery and frontal infantry assaults, though effective, carried enormous risks. Previous engagements had left tens of thousands of soldiers dead or wounded, often stalled by the intricate defenses Japanese troops had perfected over years. Commanders sought a solution that combined shock, speed, and overwhelming firepower. Rocket artillery, mounted on Sherman tanks and capable of unleashing dozens of rockets in a matter of seconds, promised just that. On islands like Iwo Jima, the terrain itself amplified the rocket's impact. Black volcanic ridges and jagged cliffs funneled explosions into narrow valleys, magnifying destruction. Smoke and debris filled the air instantly, reducing visibility and leaving infantry disoriented. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to calculating enemy movements and responding with disciplined fire, found themselves reacting to sudden, unpredictable blasts. Entire defensive sectors could be rendered untenable in moments, undermining the carefully constructed network of trenches and pillboxes. The Americans approached each engagement with a detailed understanding of Japanese defenses. Reconnaissance, aerial photography, and captured intelligence informed precise targeting. Rocket artillery was integrated as a force multiplier, not a replacement for conventional fire, but a tool to disrupt, terrorize, and pave the way for infantry advances. Its presence was both strategic and psychological. It communicated a new reality to Japanese soldiers. This was not the war they had trained for. Japanese troops quickly realized that traditional tactics were often ineffective against these weapons. Foxholes that had withstood mortar fire now collapsed under the concussive force of rocket salvos. Trenches and bunkers were shredded in moments. The sudden eruptions of fire and smoke created chaos, leaving defenders uncertain where to respond or how to regroup. Survivors reported a sensation unlike anything they had previously encountered, a whistling, screaming barrage that seemed to move faster than any conventional artillery. Commanders on the ground understood the stakes. The Japanese were facing an enemy not only armed with superior firepower, but willing to innovate rapidly. Rocket artillery represented a fusion of mobility, technological ingenuity, and psychological warfare. Infantry units had to adapt or risk annihilation. Meanwhile, American troops advancing behind the rocket-equipped Shermans gained a measure of confidence. The weapon could clear a path through the most stubborn defensive positions, reducing the exposure of men to small arms and machine gun fire. Yet the human cost remained immense. Even with rockets, every engagement required close-quarters combat, grim clearing of caves, and repeated assaults on entrenched positions. Japanese soldiers fought with ferocity, often to the last man, embodying a doctrine of sacrifice that made each victory costly. The rockets did not erase the brutality of the battlefield. They intensified it, creating an atmosphere of sudden, overwhelming destruction. By the time rockets began to rain on their positions, Japanese infantry were facing an uncomfortable truth. Their training, discipline, and courage could not always prepare them for the shock of modern mechanized firepower. Each salvo reshaped the battlefield, each explosion rewriting the rules of engagement. The stage was set. On these islands, amidst volcanic ridges, dense jungle, and coral cliffs, American rocket artillery would meet Japanese defensive genius in a clash that tested both technology and human endurance. What followed would not only shock the soldiers in the field, but also redefine perceptions of artillery and firepower for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. For the men on the ground, the first salvo of American rocket artillery was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Japanese infantry, trained to endure barrages of artillery, mortars, and naval gunfire, were suddenly confronted with a weapon that combined speed, volume, and unpredictability. Survivors later described the rocket's flight as a whistling scream, a sound that cut through the morning air and seemed to presage instant destruction. In foxholes and trenches, fear was immediate. Men clutched rifles, bracing against the concussion of nearby explosions. Some were thrown from their positions, others buried under the sudden collapse of poorly fortified shelters. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had faced waves of infantry assaults or conventional bombardments were now encountering firepower that defied expectation. Confusion, disbelief, and panic spread quickly through the ranks. Officers struggled to maintain order, shouting orders over the deafening roar, while soldiers grappled with the realization that survival depended as much on adaptation as courage. The Americans, meanwhile, observed the effect with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. Rocket artillery offered not only destruction, but the ability to shape the battlefield instantly. Infantry following behind the launchers could advance with fewer casualties, witnessing the tangible results of technological innovation in real time. The human toll, while devastating, reinforced the strategic value of combining mobility and firepower, fundamentally altering the rhythm of combat in the Pacific. Rocket artillery was not merely a psychological weapon. It represented a tactical revolution on the battlefield. Previously, assaults on fortified Japanese positions relied on prolonged bombardments, precise artillery fire, and painstaking infantry maneuvers. These methods, though effective, were slow and exposed soldiers to repeated casualties. The integration of rockets allowed commanders to saturate enemy positions rapidly, disrupting defensive cohesion and opening gaps for advancing infantry. On islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, terrain dictated tactical planning. Narrow ridges, deep valleys, and jagged cliffs created natural kill zones. Traditional artillery could soften these areas, but required careful calculation, spotters, and time to register fire. Rockets, fired in salvos from mobile platforms, could blanket these choke points instantly. The effect was both physical and strategic. Trenches collapsed, bunkers were shredded, and the enemy's ability to coordinate fire was compromised. Coordination between units was essential. Infantry, tanks, and artillery had to move as one. Rocket artillery barges were timed to precede infantry advances by seconds or minutes, ensuring that the destructive shock was felt at maximum effect while minimizing friendly fire risks. Commanders learned to exploit terrain to magnify rocket impacts, firing into valleys and along ridgelines to concentrate damage. This approach marked a shift from attritional warfare toward a combination of speed, shock, and firepower, maximizing effectiveness while reducing prolonged exposure to enemy defenses. The technological innovation behind the American rocket launchers was deceptively simple yet devastatingly effective. The T-34 Calliope, mounted atop M4 Sherman tanks, could fire 60 rockets in rapid succession. Each projectile carried a high-explosive warhead capable of destroying light fortifications and creating havoc among infantry. Unlike conventional artillery shells, rockets required minimal setup time, were mobile, and could deliver mass firepower on demand. Mechanically, the system relied on racks mounted above the tank's main gun. Rockets could be fired individually or in rapid volleys, covering wide areas almost instantaneously. The visual and auditory effect was as important as the explosive power. Smoke, debris, and fire created immediate chaos on the battlefield, while the shrieking rockets instilled fear even before impact. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to conventional artillery rhythms, the sudden, overwhelming salvos represented a complete rupture of expectation. Maintenance and deployment were straightforward for trained crews, which allowed units to move quickly across rugged terrain and bring firepower to bear precisely where needed. The synergy between technology and tactics became evident. Mobility, firepower, and shock combined into a weapon that could dictate the pace of an engagement. Rocket artillery was not a novelty. It was a deliberate solution to a specific tactical problem, engineered to break entrenched positions and maximize psychological impact without slowing the momentum of advancing forces. The combination of human, tactical, and technological perspectives shows how rocket artillery transformed the battlefield. Soldiers confronted unprecedented fear. Commanders leveraged rapid fire saturation for tactical advantage, and the engineering of the weapon itself made it adaptable to the chaotic and brutal environment of Pacific Island warfare. The psychological, strategic, and mechanical aspects of this weapon were deeply intertwined. To understand the full impact, however, one must also examine leadership decisions, enemy responses, and moral considerations, perspectives that further illuminate the consequences of this technological leap. American commanders understood that battlefield innovation required more than just new hardware. It demanded bold decision-making under extreme conditions. Leaders such as General Holland Holly Smith and Major General Lemuel C. Shepard Jr., among others, recognized that conventional artillery alone could not break the increasingly sophisticated Japanese defenses. The decision to integrate rocket artillery into frontline operations reflected a careful balance between risk and potential reward. Deploying these weapons required meticulous coordination. Launchers had to be positioned within range, yet shielded from counter-battery fire. Timing was critical to maximize shock effect while protecting advancing infantry. Commanders observed the battlefield constantly, adapting fire plans based on terrain, enemy movement, and intelligence reports. The presence of rocket-equipped Shermans changed decision-making at every level. Infantry could move faster, engineers could clear obstacles with reduced exposure, and artillery planners could redirect conventional fire elsewhere. Leadership was as much about orchestrating chaos as it was about commanding troops. The rapid adoption and deployment of rocket artillery also reflected the American military's growing flexibility in the Pacific. Rather than relying solely on attrition or prolonged bombardment, leaders embraced technology to achieve decisive outcomes quickly. Their willingness to trust new weapons and coordinate combined arms tactics would have lasting implications for how the U.S. conducted operations throughout the remainder of the war. From the perspective of Japanese infantry, rocket artillery was an unthinkable evolution of firepower. Soldiers trained in discipline, camouflage, and defensive patience now faced a weapon that nullified many of their advantages. Foxholes, bunkers, and even reinforced caves offered little protection against the sudden eruption of rockets. Reports from frontline Japanese units described the confusion and disbelief among troops. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion as the psychological effect of massed, screaming rockets spread panic. Soldiers had to adapt quickly, moving between positions, improvising cover, or attempting counterattacks under impossible conditions. Despite their rigorous training, many found that the familiar calculus of defensive warfare no longer applied. On a larger scale, Japanese command recognized the threat, but lacked the means to counter it effectively. Artillery was comparatively slow, and attempts to disrupt American rocket teams were often frustrated by mobility and protective measures. In this sense, the weapon reshaped the battlefield not only tactically but strategically, forcing Japanese forces to reconsider entrenched defensive doctrine in real time. The introduction of rocket artillery raised profound questions about the morality and psychology of warfare. For American soldiers, the effectiveness of the weapon offered a grim reassurance. Fewer men were exposed to direct fire, and entrenched enemy positions could be neutralized without prolonged assault. Yet witnessing the devastation, men buried, foxholes collapsed, and entire defensive sectors obliterated, left lasting impressions on those operating the launchers. The human cost, even when minimized, was undeniable. For Japanese infantry, the psychological toll was immense. Shock, awe, and terror became part of the battlefield calculus. The suddenness of the attacks, combined with the whistling, screaming rockets, created an environment of constant uncertainty. Soldiers could not predict where the next salvo would strike, undermining morale and eroding the discipline that had long been a hallmark of the Imperial Army. These psychological effects were as decisive as any physical destruction. Rocket artillery forced rapid decisions under extreme stress, destabilized command structures, and amplified fear among defenders. In essence, it redefined the nature of human experience on the battlefield. Victory was not only measured in positions taken or casualties inflicted, but in the ability to survive and maintain cohesion under conditions that were deliberately designed to overwhelm both body and mind. Taken together, these angles reveal a multifaceted impact. Leadership choices allowed technological innovation to reach the battlefield in ways that amplified both tactical and psychological effect. The enemy, though disciplined and well-prepared, was forced into unprecedented scenarios that challenged doctrine and adaptability. And at the human level, the experience of facing rocket artillery left an indelible mark on both sides. Awe and fear for defenders, responsibility and reflection for attackers. This combination of human, technological, tactical, and moral factors created a battlefield environment where conventional expectations no longer applied. It was a moment when innovation, courage, and the brutal realities of warfare converged, setting the stage for decisive action. The shock of rocket artillery was not an isolated event. It became the fulcrum on which entire battles could pivot. April 1st, 1945. The pre-dawn sky over Okinawa was still a heavy gray, the air damp and tense. American forces had been moving for days, pushing slowly through jagged ridges, narrow valleys, and entrenched Japanese positions. Each step forward carried risk. From the tree line, Japanese infantry watched the advancing columns, their rifles trained, their fingers tightening on grenades and machine guns. They were prepared for the familiar rhythms of war: artillery shells, mortar fire, and infantry assaults. What they were not prepared for was the sudden, unrelenting eruption of rockets. At precisely 5:12, the first salvo was launched. Sherman tanks, modified with racks of 60 rockets each, emerged from concealed positions behind ridges. The rockets streaked across the fog-laden battlefield like falling stars, their arcs illuminated briefly by the flash of ignition. When they landed, the effect was immediate and devastating. Trenches that had withstood days of bombardment collapsed. Bunkers splintered into fragments. Infantry caught in the open were thrown into the dirt, some lifeless, others scrambling in disbelief. The Japanese defenders had trained for courage, for methodical resistance. Yet the sudden shock of this weapon defied expectation. The whistle and roar of the rockets created an auditory chaos that masked the true locations of explosions, leaving soldiers disoriented. Officers attempted to rally their men, shouting commands over the deafening noise, but coordination dissolved under the relentless bombardment. Positions that were thought impregnable were suddenly untenable, forcing frantic retreats into secondary lines of defense. American infantry followed closely behind, advancing into the openings created by the rocket salvos. The synergy between rocket artillery and traditional combined arms was on full display. Tanks provided covering fire, infantry pressed forward, and engineers moved swiftly to clear obstacles and secure captured positions. Each explosion, each wall of fire, became a stepping stone for further advances. Commanders on the ground reported a rare combination of efficiency and shock. Japanese resistance, formidable as it had been, crumbled under the dual pressure of technology and momentum. Yet the battle was not a sterile display of firepower. Human cost was immediate and profound. Survivors later described the chaotic scene. Comrades buried under collapsing foxholes, smoke and debris filling every crevice, the acrid stench of burning vegetation and flesh mixing with the salty sea air. Fear and awe interwove in every soldier's perception. Defenders struggled to survive. Attackers grappled with the reality of destruction they had unleashed. Rocket artillery had changed the rhythm of combat, but it had not diminished its brutality. As the morning progressed, the Japanese attempted to regroup, moving reserves from flanking positions to reinforce lines shattered by rocket fire. American commanders, anticipating this, directed follow-up salvos to intersect these movements. Rockets hit ravines and narrow valleys, collapsing terrain features that had previously offered cover. The battlefield itself seemed to conspire with the weapon, amplifying its effectiveness and magnifying the sense of inescapable force. Reports from forward observers captured the intensity of the moment. The rocks and earth exploded around us, each salvo tearing into positions we believed secure. The air was filled with screaming, fire, and the smell of sudden death. Men ran where there was no cover, and still the rockets came, a relentless wall of destruction. The language of survivors, terse, fragmented, and vivid, conveys the immediacy of the event, the shock, and the transformative effect on those present. By 9:30, the initial objectives were largely secured. The coordinated application of rocket artillery had allowed American forces to penetrate deeply into Japanese defensive lines, seizing key terrain and disrupting command structures. Japanese troops, though still resisting in pockets, had been forced into reactive positions. The pace of the battle, once measured by attrition and slow advance, had accelerated dramatically. The technological and tactical gamble had paid off, achieving decisive results in hours rather than days. This first phase of the engagement demonstrated the full potential of rocket artillery, a fusion of mobility, concentrated firepower, and psychological disruption. It reshaped the battlefield instantly, rendering traditional expectations of defense obsolete. Commanders on both sides recognized that a new standard of warfare had arrived, one in which shock, speed, and innovation could dictate outcomes as much as discipline, courage, or terrain. The initial success of the rocket salvo set the stage for the next phase of the battle. The Japanese would attempt desperate countermeasures. Reserves would be thrown into the fray, and the full intensity of the engagement would unfold in ways that tested the limits of both technology and human endurance. By late morning, the full force of the Japanese defensive doctrine was being tested against the relentless American assault. Surviving infantry, shaken by the initial rocket barrages, attempted to regroup in secondary trenches and concealed cave networks. Officers shouted orders over the rumble of explosions, desperately trying to restore order, but the chaos wrought by the rockets had fractured command structures. Panic and confusion rippled through units that had once been disciplined and methodical, leaving gaps in the defensive lines. American commanders, anticipating such countermeasures, directed successive rocket salvos into these pockets of resistance. Tanks shifted positions, firing rockets into ravines, hillsides, and narrow valleys where troops sought shelter. Infantry advanced behind the cover of smoke and debris, securing captured terrain while engineers cleared obstacles. Each salvo forced Japanese soldiers into improvised positions, disrupting attempts at organized counterattacks. Where foxholes once provided refuge, the ground now seemed hostile in every direction. The Japanese response, though desperate, was fierce. Counterattacks with small arms and grenades erupted from caves and concealed trenches. Mortar fire rained down sporadically, attempting to slow the American advance. Yet the psychological impact of the rockets was undeniable. Soldiers hesitated, uncertainty clouding even seasoned veterans. Moments that previously would have been decisive for defenders were now opportunities for Americans to exploit disorientation, consolidating gains and pressing forward with unprecedented momentum. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the pattern was clear. Rocket artillery had not eradicated resistance entirely, but had shattered cohesion. Reports from forward observers noted entire platoons immobilized, their positions reduced to rubble, with survivors fleeing into the undergrowth. The landscape itself bore the imprint of destruction. Cratered earth, splintered trees, and collapsed fortifications marked every advance. The battlefield had been physically and psychologically transformed within hours. By early afternoon, American units reached the core of the Japanese defensive network. Rocket barges continued to clear trenches and caves while infantry engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat to secure key objectives. The synergy between technology and human maneuvering became evident. Rockets disrupted, disoriented, and softened defenses, while disciplined infantry exploited openings to press the advantage. Commanders reported a rare alignment of planning, firepower, and momentum, the ideal application of combined arms doctrine. Japanese commanders faced a stark reality. With positions destroyed and reserves depleted, the possibility of organized resistance waned. Yet, true to their training and doctrine, many troops fought to the last, refusing surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. Accounts describe soldiers remaining in ruined bunkers, firing until their ammunition was exhausted, or emerging only to face the advancing Americans. The human courage on display was formidable, yet the destructive reach of rocket artillery rendered much of it strategically futile. By late afternoon, the engagement had largely concluded. Key terrain had been secured, defensive lines broken, and surviving Japanese units scattered or consolidated into isolated pockets. The battlefield was scarred, a landscape of splintered earth, smoldering foxholes, and shattered bunkers. Observers noted the psychological imprint as well. Many soldiers, both attackers and defenders, moved with the acute awareness that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The rockets had not only destroyed positions, but altered perception, proving that speed, shock, and technological innovation could dictate the flow of battle. Reports filed that evening reflected both triumph and sobering reflection. American commanders praised the effectiveness of rocket artillery in achieving rapid, decisive results while minimizing prolonged exposure for advancing troops. Japanese officers, captured or surviving, documented the unprecedented nature of the attack, noting the disorienting effect of the rockets and the difficulty of mounting an effective countermeasure. The engagement was a testament to the evolving nature of Pacific warfare. Entrenched courage could be overwhelmed by ingenuity, and the battlefield itself had become a dynamic instrument of destruction. This turning point, forged in fire and smoke, would resonate beyond a single engagement. It validated the integration of rocket artillery into Pacific campaigns, demonstrated the power of combined arms tactics, and reshaped the psychological and strategic landscape for the remainder of the war. The battlefield, once governed by predictable patterns of attack and defense, had been irrevocably transformed. By nightfall, the battlefield bore the unmistakable marks of devastation. Trenches that had been painstakingly dug over weeks were reduced to rubble. Caves and bunkers collapsed under the concussive force of rocket salvos, and the jagged ridges were littered with debris. American forces, advancing steadily throughout the day, had secured critical objectives that had seemed nearly impregnable at dawn. The tactical impact was undeniable. Rocket artillery had allowed infantry to penetrate the Japanese defensive network with unprecedented speed, reducing the prolonged exposure that had claimed countless lives in earlier campaigns. Casualty reports painted a stark picture. Japanese forces suffered heavily, with estimates indicating that entire platoons and companies were rendered combat ineffective. Survivors recounted the sheer shock of the rockets, describing foxholes collapsing under them, and trenches wiped out almost instantly. American losses, while significant, were mitigated by the suppressive and disruptive power of the rocket salvos. Troops advancing behind the Shermans encountered less concentrated enemy fire, and units were able to exploit the chaos created among Japanese defenders. Field officers filed detailed after-action reports highlighting both the physical and psychological effectiveness of the weapon. One report noted positions that were previously regarded as strong points no longer provided shelter. The combination of rocket fire and infantry advance rendered the enemy disorganized and incapable of effective resistance. The synergy between technology and tactics was evident, and commanders emphasized the importance of continuing to integrate rocket-equipped tanks into frontline operations. The immediate strategic consequences were equally significant. By breaking through entrenched positions with relative speed, American forces gained control over critical terrain that had previously served as defensive linchpins. This allowed the consolidation of supply lines, faster reinforcement of forward units, and the ability to prepare subsequent assaults with reduced delay. Japanese commanders were forced to reevaluate defensive strategies, realizing that static positions alone could no longer withstand the shock of massed rocket artillery. The psychological impact on Japanese infantry was profound. Accounts from captured soldiers reveal a sense of disbelief and demoralization. Men who had been trained to endure artillery, mortars, and naval bombardments were unprepared for a weapon that combined instantaneous firepower with mobility and unpredictability. Officers struggled to maintain morale, while ordinary soldiers grappled with the sense that survival depended more on chance and improvisation than on discipline or courage. For the American troops, the battle reinforced the effectiveness of combined arms coordination. Infantry, armor, and rocket artillery had worked in tandem to achieve objectives more efficiently than conventional methods alone would have allowed. The success of the operation validated the calculated risk of deploying rocket-equipped Shermans, demonstrating that innovation could yield decisive results without resorting to prolonged attritional combat. Reports from naval and air observers corroborated the field accounts, noting that the psychological and physical disruption among Japanese defenders was extraordinary. Supply caches, communication lines, and forward observation posts were destroyed or neutralized before the enemy could react. The tempo of combat had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans, underscoring how technological adaptation could redefine the battlefield. The engagement also had tactical lessons for both sides. American commanders recognized the importance of maintaining mobility and ensuring that rocket teams remained protected, yet close enough to provide maximum effect. Japanese forces, in contrast, began to experiment with deeper shelters, counter-battery fire, and dispersed formations, though these adaptations would often lag behind the speed and flexibility of American technology. By the end of the first day, the battlefield told a story of transformation. Entrenched Japanese defenses had been shattered, key objectives secured, and the momentum of the campaign had shifted. Rocket artillery had not eliminated the challenges of Pacific warfare, but it had redefined the rules. Positions that had once seemed untouchable were now vulnerable, and the psychological advantage had decisively shifted toward the Americans. The immediate aftermath set the stage for longer-term consequences. The influence on subsequent campaigns, the evolution of artillery doctrine, and the enduring impact on Japanese defensive strategy. What had begun as a single engagement now promised to reverberate throughout the Pacific theater. In the days following the engagement, reports and intelligence assessments highlighted the transformative effect of rocket artillery on Pacific operations. Commanders recognized that this weapon was more than a tactical novelty. It had altered the calculus of island warfare. Previously, assaulting heavily fortified positions required extended bombardments, slow infantry advances, and a willingness to absorb high casualties. Rocket-equipped Shermans demonstrated that overwhelming, rapid firepower could neutralize defenses with speed, precision, and psychological impact. The lessons were immediate and far-reaching. American doctrine increasingly emphasized mobility, surprise, and the integration of new technologies to achieve decisive results. Rocket artillery units were systematically incorporated into assault plans for subsequent campaigns, from Okinawa to Iwo Jima, and even in planning for potential invasions of the Japanese home islands. The weapon's combination of speed and saturation fire allowed for a more dynamic application of force, enabling commanders to exploit weaknesses in entrenched defenses without committing to protracted, costly engagements. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, were forced to reconsider defensive strategies. The traditional reliance on fixed positions, rigid formations, and the expectation of withstanding conventional bombardments proved increasingly inadequate. Attempts to adapt included constructing deeper, reinforced shelters, increasing camouflage, and dispersing forces to reduce the effectiveness of massed rocket salvos. Yet these measures could not fully compensate for the mobility, volume, and psychological shock induced by the rockets. The presence of this technology fundamentally reshaped the strategic landscape, forcing Japanese forces to fight in ways that went against decades of training and doctrine. The human dimension of these changes cannot be overstated. For American infantry and tank crews, the experience reinforced the importance of coordination and innovation. Soldiers learned to rely on technology to complement, rather than replace, traditional skills. Careful maneuvering, reconnaissance, and timing remained critical, but the addition of rocket artillery provided a decisive edge. Psychological confidence grew among attacking units, as they understood that entrenched positions could be rendered ineffective before close-quarters engagement. Conversely, Japanese troops experienced the profound stress of facing a weapon that defied expectation. Survivors recalled the constant anxiety, the sudden eruptions of fire, and the collapse of positions that had seemed secure. Morale was impacted not only by the physical destruction, but by the realization that even disciplined courage and meticulous preparation could be overwhelmed by technological innovation. The psychological dimension of rocket artillery thus became a central component of its strategic effect, contributing to the erosion of defensive cohesion and hastening surrender or withdrawal in later engagements. Strategically, the use of rocket artillery influenced operational planning beyond individual battles. American commanders incorporated the weapon into broader offensive campaigns, understanding that speed and shock could be force multipliers. Combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, became more sophisticated, leveraging rocket artillery to shape the battlefield in ways previously unimaginable. In this sense, a single technological innovation had ripple effects that extended throughout the Pacific theater, affecting both tactical engagements and overarching strategy. The legacy of these engagements also extended into post-war military thinking. Analysts and historians would later cite the effectiveness of rocket artillery in disrupting entrenched positions as a key example of how technological adaptation could redefine combat. Lessons learned in the Pacific informed Cold War-era artillery doctrine, mechanized warfare principles, and the continued integration of psychological impact into battlefield planning. Rocket artillery was no longer simply a tool. It had become a symbol of innovation's decisive role in modern warfare. By the conclusion of the campaign, the battlefield itself bore witness to these changes. Ridgelines, trenches, and bunkers were scarred, not only by explosions but by the rapid evolution of tactics and technology. American forces had demonstrated that courage, preparation, and discipline, while essential, could be amplified by innovation, and that enemy expectations could be weaponized as effectively as physical firepower. Japanese forces, though resilient, had encountered a paradigm shift in combat, one that would influence the conduct of the war until its final days. The aftermath of rocket artillery use thus extended beyond immediate victories. It reshaped doctrine, redefined psychological and tactical approaches, and accelerated the integration of technology into every level of operational planning. The battlefield was no longer static. It had become a dynamic space, shaped as much by innovation as by terrain or manpower. This evolution set the stage for final confrontations, preparing both attackers and defenders for the climactic engagements that would ultimately decide the fate of the Pacific War. In the stillness after the battle, the scars of war remained etched across the islands. Cratered earth, shattered bunkers, and the remnants of foxholes told a story not just of firepower, but of human endurance and innovation. Rocket artillery had achieved what few imagined possible. It had reshaped the battlefield in moments, rendered formidable defenses vulnerable, and tested the limits of courage on both sides. For the men who faced it, the experience lingered long after the guns fell silent. Japanese infantry carried memories of sudden destruction, of positions collapsing without warning, of comrades swept away in explosions that left no time to react. American soldiers, too, bore the weight of what technology had unleashed. The rockets allowed them to advance with a sense of tactical advantage, yet they were also confronted with the stark reality of human cost, the debris of war, the wounded and the dead, and the knowledge that innovation could amplify both efficiency and devastation. Beyond the immediate battlefield, rocket artillery symbolized a broader evolution in warfare. It marked the moment when human ingenuity, combined with industrial capability, could redefine what was possible in combat. Speed, precision, and psychological impact became as decisive as courage and discipline. The Pacific War, already a crucible of human endurance, had shown that technology was no longer auxiliary. It could shape the very outcome of battles, campaigns, and ultimately, history itself. Yet, amidst this calculus of destruction, there remains a human lesson. War, even when measured in innovation and tactical advantage, exacts a universal cost. The roar of rockets, the collapse of positions, and the relentless march of strategy are reminders that technology amplifies not only power, but responsibility. Those who wield it must reckon with the consequences, and those who endure it must adapt or be swept aside. In the end, the story of rocket artillery in the Pacific is more than a tale of firepower. It is a story of adaptation, of human resilience in the face of overwhelming change, and of the ways in which ingenuity and courage collide on the battlefield. It is a reminder that in war, as in history, the future is often defined by those who dare to innovate and by those who must survive the unforeseen.